Well, I'm recording. It said I didn't have enough room on this just to record, and now all of a sudden I do. So I don't know. We'll see. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. I had some pistachios before I came here. So don't, do that to my teeth, would you please? I was hungry. I still am hungry. We're on chapter 4 of The Sign of the Beaver. I don't even know who makes up these titles. I don't even know what's going on half the time with the weird stuff that's going on. But it's a good story, and it is a yearling Newberry book. Oh, these adults like hee 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 hee. Let's call it. I don't know what's the matter with some people, but it's a good story. Chapter 4. It was hard to be deprived of the hunting. Now, whenever he went into the forest, the squirrels and the rabbits frisked about boldly, knowing perfectly well he had no gun in his hands. Once he was certain he could have had a good shot at a deer. Instead, he went fishing, and he knew he ought to be grateful that the creek and the pond could provide all the food he needed, even though fish didn't seem to stick to his ribs like a good meat stew. Here and there, in a sunny spot, he discovered a patch of blueberries. Gradually, his spirits rose again. The July weather was perfect. The flies and mosquitoes were less bothersome. He began to count the days ahead instead of the ones he had notched. 2 or 3 more sticks, and his family would be here. The corn was growing taller. The little hard green pumpkins were rounding out. He could wait a little longer. Perhaps he even became a mite careless. He had been fishing all one morning, a good clear day, the water still nippy on his ankles, the sun warm on his bare head. He had followed the creek a long way and had a lucky catch. He came whistling out of the woods, swinging 4 speckled trout. He quieted down. He quieted down of a sudden when he heard a crackling in the underbrush close by. Then he stopped short at sight of the cabin. The door was swinging open at a crazy angle, one hinge broken. Across the door sill, some white stuff dribbled like spilled flour. What With a shout, he dropped the fish and ran. It was flour, tracked all over the cabin floor. The sack ripped open and dragged across the room. The cabin was a shambles, the stools overturned, the shelf swept bare, the precious molasses keg upside down on the floor and empty. Ben must have come back. For a moment, hot sparks of anger drove every sensible thought out of his head. Then he knew it couldn't have been Ben. Ben was too fond of food to waste it. Indians? No, it wasn't possible any human being would scatter food about like this. With a sinking heart, he realized what happened. He remembered the thrashing in the underbush. It had to be a bear. Somehow he had neglected to bar the door securely. Well, the damage was done, and the bear would be half a mile away by now. Helpless with fury at his own carelessness, he stood for some time in the middle of the cabin, unable to pull his wits together. Then he went down on his hands and knees and carefully began to scrape up traces of flour. After a time, he gave up. The best he managed to salvage was 2 handfuls of gritty, unappetizing meal, even though he took the good pewter spoon and dug into the hollows of the dirt floor. After a long time, he felt hungry enough to remember the fish. Half-heartedly, he cleaned them and blew the fire and roasted them. He found a few grains of salt left in the tin to sprinkle on them. He would have to make the best of it. He wouldn't starve as long as he had a fish line, but tomorrow he would not even have salt. Chapter 5. Day after day, he kept remembering the bee tree. He and his father had discovered it weeks ago. High in the tree, it was at the swampy edge of the pond they had called Loon Pond. The bees were buzzing in and out of an old woodpecker hole. Matt had thought they were wild bees, but his father said no, there were no bees at all in America till the colonists brought them from England. This swarm must have escaped from one of the river towns. Bees were better left alone, Pa said. He felt he could scarcely endure another meal of plain fish. He was hungry for a bit of something tasty. Knowing so well his fondness for molasses, his mother had persuaded them to carry a little keg all the way to Maine when his father would rather have gone without. She would have smiled to see him running his finger round and round the empty keg like a child and licking off the last drop the bear had missed. Now he couldn't stop thinking about that honey. It would be worth a sting or two just to have a taste of it. There couldn't be much danger in going up that tree and taking just a little, a cupful perhaps, that the bees would never miss. One morning he made up his mind to try, come what might. It was an easy tree to climb, with branches as neatly placed as the rungs of a ladder. The bees did not seem to notice as he pulled himself higher and higher. Even when his head was on a level with the hole, they flew lazily in and out, not paying him any mind. The hole was small, not big enough for his hand and the spoon he had brought with him. Peering in, he could just glimpse far inside the golden mass of honeycomb. The bark all around the hole was rotted and crumbling. Cautiously, he put his fingers on the edge and gave a slight tug. A good-sized piece of bark broke off into his hand. With it came the bees. With a furious buzzing, they came pouring out of the broken hole. The humming grew to a roar like a great wind. Matt felt a sharp pain on his neck, then another and another. The angry creatures swarmed along his hands and bare arms, and his hair, on his face. How he got down out of the tree he never remembered. Water. If he could reach water, he could escape them. Bellowing and waving his arms, he plunged toward the pond. The bees were all around him. He could not see through the whirling cloud of them. The boggy ground sucked at his feet. He pulled one foot clear out of his boots, went stumbling over sharp roots to the water's edge, and flung himself forward. His foot caught in a fallen branch, and he wrenched it clear. Dazed with pain, he sank down into the icy shelter of the water. He came up choking just above the water. The angry bees circled. Twice more he ducked his head and held it down until his lungs were bursting. He tried to swim out into the pond, but his feet were tangled in dangling weeds. When he tried to jerk them free, a fierce pain rang up his leg, and he went under again, thrashing his arms wildly. Then something lifted him up. His head came up from the water, and he gulped air from his aching lungs. He felt strong arms around him. Half conscious, he dreamed that his father was carrying him, and he did not wonder how this could be. Presently he knew he was lying on dry ground. Those eyelids were swollen almost shut. He could see two figures bending over him, unreal, half-naked figures with dark faces. Then, as his wits began to return to him, he saw that they were Indians, an old man and a boy. The man's hands were reaching for his throat, and in panic, Matt tried to jerk away. "Not move," a deep voice ordered. "Bee needles have poison. Must get out." Matt was too weak to struggle. He could not even lift his head. Now that he was out of the cold water, his skin seemed to be on fire from head to toe, yet he could not stop shivering. He had to lie helpless while the man's hands moved over his face and neck and body. Gradually he realized that they were gentle hands, probing and rubbing at one tender spot after another. His panic began to die away. He could still not think clearly. Things seemed to keep fading before he could quite grasp them. He could not protest when the man lifted him again and carried him like a baby. It did not seem to matter where they were taking him, but shortly he found himself lying on his bed in his own cabin. He was alone. The Indians were gone. He lay too tired and sore to figure out how he came to be there, knowing only that the nightmare of whirling bees and choking water was past, and that he was safe. Some time passed. Then once again the Indian was bending over him, holding a wooden spoon against his lips. He swallowed in spite of himself, even when he found it was not food, but some bitter medicine. He was left alone again, and presently he slept. We're going to go on to chapter 6. Finally, Matt woke and knew that he was well. His body was no longer on fire. He could open his eyes, and he saw that sunlight glinted through the chinks in the roof. All his familiar things were around him, the shelves with the pewter dishes, his jacket hanging on the peg. He felt as though he had been on a long journey and had come home. He must have slept through half a day and a night. When the cabin door opened, the Indian entered. Matt hastily pulled himself up. Now, with clear eyes, he saw that there was nothing in the least strange about this man. He was dressed not so differently from Matt's own father, in a coat of some rough brown cloth and leggings fringed down the side. His face was smooth shaven, and so was his whole head, except for one long black top knot. When he saw that Matt was awake, his stern face was lighted by a wide smile. Good. It was half word, half grunt. White boy very sick. Now well. Matt remembered his father's advice. Good morning, he said respectfully. The Indian pointed a hand at his own chest. Sackness, family of Beaver, he said. He seemed to be waiting. I'm Matthew Hallowell, Matt answered. Good. White man leave you here? Just for a while, Matt told him. He has gone to get my mother. It did not occur to him to lie to this old man as he had to Ben. Moreover, he knew that there was something he had to say. He tried to find the right words. I'm grateful to you, he said finally. I was very lucky. It was a very lucky thing you happened to find me. We watch. White boy very foolish to climb bee tree. So he had been right, Matt thought. That eyes were watching him from the forest. He was sure that the Indian had not asked him where he lived. They had brought him straight home to this cabin. Even though he knew it was his good fortune they'd been watching him yesterday, he still felt somewhat resentful of their spying. Abruptly, he swung his feet to the floor and winced as a sharp pain ran up his leg. The Indian noticed, and moving closer, he saw Matt's ankle between his hand and pressed gently with his fingers. Not broken, Matt said. Nada, not broke. Mend soon. Sleep now. Not need medicine more. The Indian had put something on the table as he came in. When he had gone, Matt hobbled over to see what it was and found a wooden bowl of stew, thick and greasy, flavored with some strange plants, wonderfully filling and strengthening. With it there was a cake of cornbread, coarser than his own, but delicious. The next day the Indian brought the boy with him. Nickwinis, you call grandson, he announced. 18. The two boys stared at each other. The Indian boy's black eyes held no expression whatsoever. Unlike the old man, he was naked except for a breechcloth held up by a string at his waist, which we learned about when we were, if you were a Cherokee. It passed between his legs and hung down like a little apron back and front. His heavy black hair fell straight to his shoulders. 18 same winter as white boy, maybe? The man asked. He held up 10 fingers and then 4 more. I'm 13, Matt answered, holding up his own fingers. At least, he excused himself, that would be true in another week. The Indian boy did not speak a word. Quite plainly, he had been brought here against his will. He stared about the cabin and seemed to despise everything he saw. He made Matt feel like a fool sitting with his leg propped up on a stool. Matt steadied himself on his good leg and stood up. Now he noticed that Sackness was holding out to him a rough sort of crutch. Matt wished he did not have to try it right now with both of them watching him, but he could see that the man expected it. He managed a few steps, furious at his own clumsiness. He had never imagined how pesky a crutch could be. Moreover, although he was not the slightest change in the boy's face, Matt was sure 18 was laughing at him. There was a nasty little gleam in the boy's eyes. The moment they were gone, he seized the crutch in earnest, and very soon he could swing himself along a good, brisk pace. Now he was able to get about outside the cabin, to check the corn patch and bring in firewood. The trouble was he had only one boot. The wooden stocking his mother had knitted for him was wearing thin. On the rough ground it wore through in no time. This too the Indian noticed when he came with his grandson next morning. No boot, he said, pointing. I lost it, Matt said. It came off in the mud when I ran. Once again, he felt ridiculous under the Indian boy's black stare. 3 days later, Sackness brought him a pair of moccasins. They were handsome and new, of moose hide, dark and glistening with grease, tied with stout thongs that were long enough to wrap around his ankles. Beaver women make, Sackness said. Better white man's boots. White boy see. Matt took off his one boot and slipped on the moccasins. Indeed, they were better. In fact, they were wonderful. Not stiff like new leather boots. Not knobby or pinching anywhere. Light as nothing at all when he lifted his feet. No wonder Indians did not make a sound when they walked in the forest. Shame suddenly flooded over Matt. This man had perhaps saved his life, had come bringing food and a crutch, and now these beautiful moccasins. It wasn't enough just to say an awkward thank you. He needed to give him something in return, not money. There were a few silver coins in the tin box, but something made him very sure that he could not offer money to this proud old man. He looked about him in despair. There was almost nothing of his own in the cabin. Then he spied the 2 books on the shelf, the only 2 his father had been able to carry into the wilderness. One was a Bible. He dared not give away his father's Bible. The other book was his own, the only one he ever possessed, Robinson Crusoe. He had read it a dozen times and thought of parting with it was painful, but it was the only thing he had to give. He hobbled across the room and took it down from the shelf and held it out to the Indian. Sackness stared at it. It's for you, Matt said. It's a gift. Please take it. Sackness reached out and took the book in his hands. He turned it over and over slowly, his face showing not a sign of pleasure. Then he opened it and stood peering at the page. With shame, Matt saw that he was holding it upside down. He couldn't read. Of course he couldn't. Matt should have known that. He had made a terrible mistake and embarrassed the good man. He had heard once that the one thing an Indian could never forgive was a hurt to his pride. He felt his own face burning, but Sackness did not look embarrassed. His dark stare went from the book to Matt's face. White boy no signs? He asked. Matt was puzzled. White boy read what white man right here? Yes, Matt admitted. I can read it. For a long moment the Indian studied the book. Then astonishingly, that rare white smile flashed. Good, he grunted. Sackness make treaty. A treaty? Matt was even more puzzled. Nickwennis hunt. Bring white boy bird and rabbit. White boy teach a teen white man signs. You mean I should teach him to read? Good. White boy teach a teen what book say. Doubtfully, Matt looked from the old man to the boy, who stood silently listening. His heart sank. The scorn in the boy's face had turned to black anger. Nada! The furious word exploded, the first word Matt had ever heard him speak. Half under his breath, he muttered a string of incomprehensible words. His grandfather's stern face did not change. He was undisturbed by the boy's defiance. A teen learn, he said. White man come more and more to Indian land. White man not make treaty with pipe. White man make signs on paper. Signs Indian not know. Indian put mark on paper to show him friend of white man. Then white man take land. Tell Indian cannot hunt on land. Ateen learn to read white man's signs. Ateen not give away hunting grounds. The boy glowered at his father, but he did not dare to speak again. With a black scowl, he stalked out of the cabin. Good, said Sackness calmly. He handed the book back to Matt. Ateen come Seba tomorrow. We are on chapter 7. That's awesome. I love this story. Thanks for joining me here in the reading room. We're reading The Sign of the Beaver by Elizabeth George Speare, author of The Witch and the Blackbird Pond. Witch of the Blackbird Pond. Dr. Annette Feravich. I'm teaching your mind to be healthy, your body to be healthy, so that your mind to be healthy, your spirit to be healthy, so that your body is healthy as well. Dr. Annette Feravich, I'm the teacher. Thanks for joining me in the reading room. I'll see you Tuesday.